Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I would like to discuss a wonderful book of nonfiction written by an American pianist, teacher, musicologist. The name of the book is Men, Women and Pianos, and the author of that book is Arthur Loesser. Perhaps it's Arthur Loesser, I'm not quite sure of the pronunciation, my apologies. If I got it wrong, I'll just continue with Loesser, that's okay with you. Now, Loesser was, as I said, a pianist and a teacher. He was teaching classical music and piano at Cleveland University. And he also wrote a couple of books. But really the one that we are interested in right now is probably his most well-known book, Men, Women and Pianos. Published in 1954. There's been a couple of reissuing since. It's relatively easy to find, as most things are these days. And of course, I would love if you could run by and read that book. But as usual, also, the fact that I tell you it's a great book might not be enough. So I want to give you 3 reasons why this book not only is good in itself, but 3 reasons why this book illustrates aspects of writing, aspects of fiction or non-fiction writing and literature in general. And those 3 reasons are: 1, when history goes beyond the object of its study to become social history. And that is what this book perfectly illustrates. The second reason will be derived directly from the first, that will become very clear, and that is the famous Fernand Braudel's phrase, everything is connected, everything is related. And that is, of course, one of the strengths of social history. And third will be slightly different. We'll be talking about style in non-fiction, style in controversial issues at times, perhaps. And that book also illustrates this perfectly. Now, let's get on with it. The first reason, therefore, is why this book is excellent, is that it is not simply the history of something, it is a social history that is something much more complex and global, and therefore perhaps also much more interesting. Now, the first thing to say, perhaps, is that really one of the main arguments running through the book, is that the development of the piano has very little to do with music. And so this book is not really about music. There are, of course, references to and pages dedicated to music, but not in a sort of appreciation sense, or beautiful music or whatever. Music as quite simply the result of banging on the keys from the first. And desire for music perhaps driving the piano, and development of the piano driving the production of new music. But really, that's it. The book is not about music, nor is it about piano playing. There's nothing about technique, only in relation to specific technological problems, but it's not about pianos either. And that is, of course, why history is absolutely wonderful when it is factual, but it is even better when it becomes social history, when it takes in all the aspects of social life and see the relationship between those aspects. So, essentially, if it's not about music, if it's not really about pianos, if it's not about art and creation, what is this book about? Well, the book takes as a starting point a very simple fact, which is that up until the time that it was written, 1954, probably 53, and really continuing well later in the 20th century, I think, is quite simply that the piano was ubiquitous in American houses, in French houses, in English houses, and probably German and Italian and whatever houses. In other words, the piano was everywhere. And the piano was not everywhere in rich people's houses, the piano was everywhere in everybody's houses. Now, of course, you will say to me that the poorest certainly didn't have a piano in the house. So, obviously, I mean that it didn't have to remain in the upper layers of societies at all. It, in fact, permeated middle class and lower middle class as well. And we all know people who had a piano, which in fact was in the middle of the room or in the corner of the room, and on which you could see a whole lot of things put, vases, books, towels, and very obviously those pianos were hardly ever played, yet they remained there. And so we all understand, of course, that the piano seemed to have a function beyond its immediate musical function, which is a status symbolic function. And so that is the first question of this book. That is the original, or the origin and the original question of this book is, why the piano? Why not the flute? Why not the cello, or the violin, or the marimba, or whatever? Why the piano? And that is, of course, where we have the starting point of social history. So, Loesser the author starts off by, of course, putting us in context, giving some background to the question, and the background is obviously the development of the piano as instrument, musical instrument this time. And so, we get a lot of very interesting information if you, like me, are interested in pianos and music in general, but even if you're not, all those details will come good, and that's what we'll explore in a minute, in the second part, of course, of this video. But from the fact that Beethoven, like hundreds, thousands of pianists after him, was already sponsored by a piano manufacturer, so that he would actually always have that brand of piano wherever he played, and he would be, of course, paid a little bit by those manufacturers to play those pianos. Something that, of course, continues to this day. From great manufacturing firms of piano we know today to fake ones or smaller ones faking the big ones to sell more. All those things come into it, of course, the range of the piano, the massive 19th century concerts. But really, basically, the piano is the instrument of the 19th century, or the 19th century is the century of the piano. So, what he finds is that a driving force behind the development of the piano, or rather the development of the piano throughout society, is what I mean in houses, is women. Women took up the piano. Now, you have to say, why? Why didn't women pick up, I don't know, again, the flute, or the violin, or the cello, any of those instruments? Surely there were more instruments that women could have picked up. And that is why this book is wonderful and reminds us that social history is wonderful, is, as Loesser himself says, the development of the piano has got nothing to do with music. It's got nothing to do with art and aesthetics and creation and looking for beauty. And no. The piano's development is entirely the result of two things: a certain society and a certain societal culture, and business. And that's it. And that's where you see that when we imbue an object with a certain meaning or symbolic meaning, like the piano, for example, beauty, Mozart, playing whatever, we are, in fact, ignoring the fact that such an object takes place, or the development of such an object takes place, of course, in a context. What is that context? Well, it's historical, it's cultural, it's societal, etc., financial. And that context cannot be ignored. You cannot say, well, the piano took up because people loved the sound of it, because that would be weird. Really, why the sound of this one and not the sound of that one? It would also be very, very easy to say, well, the piano is easier to play than the flute, so women just took up the piano because it was the point of entry is easier. Well, yeah, but I mean, there are many instruments that are pretty easy to play. Harmonica easy to play. I don't know, bongos. The piano is not the only instrument where the entry level is relatively low. And in any case, if you really want to play and enjoy playing great music, you're going to have to really work hard at it. And that's going to be true for any instrument you pick up in any case. So, or both, 19th century saw an enormous, massive very, very quick development and increase development of the piano as instrument and increase in sales of pianos. All the houses had one. I mean, again, I'm generalizing, of course, but and you had to have one, as usual, in a sort of socially competitive society where status counts for a lot, as it did in the 19th century. Of course, it still does today in the 21st. If your neighbors have a piano, you have to have one. And that in turn, of course, brings more pianos to the fore, not only in shops, but also in houses that you go and visit. So this book really reminds us that no, women took it up for a reason. It cannot have been a simple musical, or aesthetic, or artistic reason. There must have been something else. What could have been that something else? Well, that is the thread running through the book. Women had to take up the piano, or were strongly encouraged to take up the piano, simply because of the cultural climate and the social climate of the time. Remember, 19th century America, a country still strongly under the influence of its Protestant founders and ethics, where in sort of small midtown America, as Fanny Trollope, for example, observed many times, and as Gottschalk himself observed many times as well, the segregation between men and women, not eating together, for example, not going to the same events together, a crying absence of cultural highlights, and also, quite simply, great difficulties in just going out and meeting people. So women took up the piano, and not the flute or not the violin, not because of the ease with which you can play the piano. The piano is very big, right? It's a lot easier to have a cello. No, the women were subject to, of course, decorum. They had to look a certain way and they had to act a certain way, which was seen as being the moral, i.e. the right way. So if you consider that, you consider immediately that playing the cello for a woman was a simple no-no. Why? Because the cello is played opening your legs, you put the cello between your legs, and then you play like this. But of course, in such a society where morals were very, very strict, the idea of a woman opening her legs was way too suggestive, so the cello was a no. The violin was a no, because of the posture. The violin you put under here, your neck, between your neck and your shoulder. And so the posture was not deemed aesthetic enough. It was just unseemly. And of course, just as unseemly or ungainly it was for a woman to go and blow in a flute or in a saxophone, which is a bit later, of course, or any horn type of instrument, quite simply because then your cheeks explode, you get red in the face, and it's just not, you can't have a woman behaving that way at that time. The piano, on the other hand, was a lot easier in moral terms because the posture is erect, back is straight, your legs are close to one another, and there is a certain type of elegance in having those lithe little fingers running on the ivory keys. So that's the first reason why the piano was taken up. The second reason is, you might say, well, okay, but why would those women want to play the piano in the first place? It's all very nice that they can't play the cello, so they think, oh, I'm desperate to play an instrument. I've got to have something. I can't do the cello, I can't do the horns, I'm going to do the piano. No. And that's really the first or second or whatever main arguments in Loesser's Men, Women and Pianos that we're talking about right now. Women had to, because of their societal position, had to find a way to fend for themselves. And there are very few ways in the 19th century when you're, say, a middle-class woman, because basically you're barred from education. That's the thing. There was no higher education for women until very late in the 19th century. In any case, it was not widely spread. There were very few. There were much fewer, very few sometimes, opportunities for women to learn beyond the very basics of arithmetics and writing and reading. That is also the reality. Of course, professions were simply unattainable for women. Jobs in general were simply out of the question, except a few menial jobs as usual. But becoming a doctor, a lawyer, a car mechanic, well, not in the 1850s, but all those things were, of course, completely out of reach for women. So women had very few choices. For example, stay at home, take care of the parents, inherit the house, grow old, spinster, etc. type of scenario. Or, of course, found a family, that is, find somebody to marry, either because they wanted to or because their parents were desperate for her to go and get married. All those things played a role. Why? Because at that time, 19th century, even earlier, but 19th century, certainly, for example, if you look at England and America, women, that type of women, that class of women, were expected to have what was called achievements, and achievements were basically sort of little sparkles on the cloth. In other words, a veneer of this, a veneer of that, the ability to chat a bit, to perhaps knit a bit, to take care of domestic matters, to be educated enough to perhaps take care of the accounts of the house, be prepared to become a mother, of course, and a veneer of culture and, let's say, higher spirits. What is that? Music, for example. In most places in America at that time, it was not possible really to, for example, act in a play or put on a play even. And so all those, again, means of artistic creations or artistic expressions were, very thin on the ground. One way to make oneself attractive, therefore, was to appeal to those higher aesthetics by playing a little bit of music. That was one of the required achievements for women. Now, once you play a bit of music, you make it easier to present yourself, for example, in familiar settings, in Sunday after church, at home, tea and choir. And therefore, of course, you make yourself more attractive. Let's be very brutal about this, and I apologize for the crudity of the expression, but you make yourself much more attractive on the wife market, which is, of course, to some extent what it was. So this is the power of social history. And this is why this book is so much more than what it seems to be when you just look at the cover. Social history takes in an object of study, whatever it is, and looks for connections between that object of study and the rest of society. And doesn't presume to say, this became important because it was great, but rather ask the question, it became important, but why? Why this and not that? Are there social, cultural, historical reasons for that object to become important or to disappear, of course? And what are those reasons and how do they interconnect? Social histories that are absolutely wonderful to read about, but there are millions of them, obviously. Just a couple that I really like. The wonderful French historian Michel Pastoureau and his work on colors, absolutely fascinating field of study. How were colors not only perceived before Middle Ages, even before and late Middle Ages, but also what they meant symbolically, what they meant culturally. And that's where you realize that even though it looks to be a very objective data, color, it is, of course, a highly cultural construct. Pastoureau did also some brilliant work on animals. For example, animals in the Middle Ages, their symbolism, their cultural meaning, and where that comes from, and how that influences the rest of the social aspects in France, in England, for example. Social histories are about food, of course, banquets, about drinks. Social histories, French historian write a couple, for example, on the social history of silence, of the rain. And basically, of course, the idea is not to examine the rain or the silence. It is to establish the connections between that object of study and the rest of society and how they not only intersect but co-influence one another. And that is the second reason that this beautiful book by Arthur Loesser deserves to be read, and that is the interconnectedness of things. Now, this, of course, phrase we owe to the great French historian Fernand Braudel. And you remember John Donne, obviously, no man is an island. Well, Braudel said, no fact exists on its own. That's basically what he said. So no object, no development, no invention, no attitude exists completely on its own. It's always the product of a multiplicity of causes, basically, and reactions, chains of reactions, counter-reactions. One change in one domain will bring about change in different domains, which themselves will bring change to different domains, a sort of ripple effect, where it's not simply a sort of centered ripple that is originating from one thing and rippling around like this. No, it's different objects at different time, at the same time, creating ripples which all intersect and which all reinforce or perhaps cancel one another. Here we have really two main branches of that connectedness of things. The piano has technological evolution. The piano is easier to play, yes. But it also becomes, therefore, a way to express different sentiments, different moods, and that is, for example, what drove one major technological development in the piano is the ability to play softly or loudly. That is, the ability to have what is called a dynamic keyboard, where the keyboard responds to your touch, which was, of course, not the case with pianoforte or harpsichords, for example. Well, okay, cool. Well, yeah, but that means also that this desire for expression drove technological change. Now, those technological changes in themselves brought about two things. They brought about, one, the development of the piano as a concert instrument that could project sound, which, of course, then makes the piano a centerpiece of the orchestra, which in turn imbues it with even more symbolic power, of course, and popularity. And the second thing, of course, is that any of those changes in the technology that enables more expression make, obviously, the instrument easier to play, in the sense that if the keyboard really reacts to your touch, it doesn't take an enormous amount of talent to bang on the key or hit them softly, and that expression suddenly becomes much more attainable. There are many, many other areas of technological development in the piano or around the piano that led to or were caused by musical or societal development. Very obviously, if pianos are very hard to play, extremely bulky, and don't sound good, whichever achievement women have to have doesn't make the piano an attractive proposition and reserves it, of course, to the higher layers of society. Now, if you want to have a mass distribution of a new object like the piano, very obviously you have to make sure that, one, it can be bought by many more people than the upper layers of society. Two, it can fit any sort of interior. And three, it is let's say, movable enough that different types of people, different types of interiors, different types of uses can also be applied to it. And so, of course, that led to a reduction in size, that led to technological changes in strings, in the way you put the strings, the hammers, all those things go hand in hand. But it would be foolish to think that the piano developed of its own accord. The technological development of the piano was driven by societal changes, and themselves were accompanied by, reinforced by, those new technological development taking place at the same time. The second aspect of that interconnectedness that Loesser highlights in this book is the fact that it was a cultural evolution as well. Why? A cultural revolution in the sense that it required a different type of music. At the time, of course, you know that you could only hear music either live, the concert hall, or on a village square, or not at all. Right? If you could read music, you may hear the music in your head while reading sheet music, but for the common, as it were, non-music reader people, that was simply not possible. So then you needed places to go to. What are those places? Well, again, if you're talking about a society which is very prude and very restrictive in terms of morals, as America in the 1850s, then you realize, of course, that concert halls, for example, were not necessarily, well, the place where everybody would go to, and certainly there were not that many of them anyway in Midtown America. So you have the village square, perhaps, and the dances after the harvest of the church service, and the house, as place for that as well. And that means that, of course, of all those millions of girls who suddenly had to take up the piano, surely many of them were not either proficient or interested enough. And that's exactly what Loesser summarizes as the 19th century being the century of things needed to be brilliant but not difficult. Brilliant, because if you want to make your achievement attractive to men, you have to have certain level, certain ability to sound good, but not difficult, because of course most of those poor young women had no interest, talent, time, or dedication to become good enough, to become competent enough with their instrument. So that in turn, of course, led to the development of different types of concert halls, but also different types of music being written, which in turn led some musicians to abandon touring or playing, to turn themselves only to creating sheet music that would be brilliant on the surface but easy to play, exercises, and of course reduction of opera airs that are well known or folk tunes that people had heard. And that led, of course, in turn to the creation of an enormous industry, a really huge industry in the 19th century of sheet music. And obviously, if you're at home and you have a piano, you need sheet music. If you don't want to improvise. And therefore, you need something to play. And if it's got to be brilliant but not too difficult, well, you need somebody to write things like that for you. And all those things, again, go hand in hand. Religion, business, technology, society, people, all of those. And of course, that takes place, as I said, within a certain cultural outlook, which is, of course, heavily business focused. And as usual, and as we said in the beginning, taking place within the cultural context of women's position in such a society, regulation of morals and regulation of civic attitude and behavior by religious morals. And all those things work hand in hand. And that's it. And that's why this book is not about the piano. It's not about music. It's not about the beauty of music. No. This book is about a certain context at a certain time in which different developments were taking place. And all of them together led to the development of the piano as the instrument. So, finally, a quick word about the style of this book. It's extremely well written. Not in the sense of beautiful sentences that go on, evocative of beauties of the mountains. Extremely well written in the sense that there is great rhythm to it. It is very funny. It can be a bit mean at times or have acerbic comments that you may not see coming. He is very ironic. And he obviously pays great attention to the way he writes and to the way it sounds. Now, I'll put a couple of examples, which is never a good idea because an example is always reductive, but nevertheless, to give you an idea of the type of attention he paid to his writing. Whether you like it or not is a second thing, as it were, but you can see the attention paid to it. Now, why am I talking about style? Well, obviously, because style in nonfiction really greatly helps, right? If you write with a wooden leg, that's not going to be good enough for transmitting information and encouraging the reader to think about what you're saying. Now, if you write about nonfiction and certainly social history like this, which very quickly becomes not complex to read, but complex because it's a complex image with a whole lot of threads running through and interconnecting. If you don't write well, or if you write very dryly, it becomes very boring and you're going to lose your reader. That's the reality of it. Now, Loesser writes extremely well, and that's great because it facilitates the reading. It makes it a lot easier, a lot more enjoyable. Quite simply, you want to read it, not simply because of the content, but also because of the way it's written. It's a joy to read. At the same time, this is why I'm talking about style today, there were reactions against the book in terms of its misogyny or perceived misogyny. And when I read those comments, when I saw those responses, I was a bit taken aback because it seemed to me that it was very clear. The argument in Loesser's book has nothing to do with misogyny. It's got to do, of course, with women being a victim of their own social position imposed on them from outside by an extremely patriarchal society regulated by religious morals. So they had very few choices, as I said. And if they made those choices, for example, the piano, it's under duress. It's very important to remember this. So when he is dismissive of those young American women not being able to play difficult pieces, he's very careful to say that he knows why. And he understands why. And that's got nothing to do with those women. It is very critical of the society around them, which forced them to become that. He is very critical of the commercial attitude around the piano. Remember, Loesser was a pianist, he was a musician. He had dedicated his life to music and creative and artistic expression. He was dismayed to see that the piano had developed not as a means to create beauty, but as a simple business proposition originating in a certain view of the world and therefore of women. Now, of course, if you miss the stylistic element and you take everything at face value, then of course you misunderstand the irony. The irony is not about women, of course not. The irony is directed at that system that depowers, empowers women and forces them in a certain direction from which other people, men, will profit. And that's just the word I wanted to say about the style in this book is do not be confused if and when you read it. Loesser is obviously not a misogynist. Loesser is very clear about where he stands in relation to all this. But his style, which can sometimes be a little bit mean, very ironic, sound dismissive, is a great vehicle for engagement on your part. And it is, of course, I think a great bonus to be able to read such a rich, fascinatingly interesting book in that language, as opposed to having to go through hundreds of pages of the same information, but written in a style that simply stops you right in your tracks. So, in conclusion, what can we say? Men, Women and Pianos by Arthur Loesser is a wonderful example of social history at its best, where it reminds us that we are such a complex society. We are such complex societies in general, and that we tend, for plenty of reasons, to reduce things to their simplest form at times. And we forget, of course, that we are more complex, that we do things for plenty of other reasons than the reasons we think we have. And then things do not happen just like that. They happen because the array of aspects that constitute a society, all those aspects intersect, influence one another, and depend heavily on other aspects to survive, thrive, shrivel, disappear, remain, be forgotten. And so this book is a wonderful exploration of that through the prism of piano, and it's a wonderful illustration of how beautiful, how complex, how crazy we can be. So I hope that you now rush to your local bookshop, order the book, read it with great pleasure, and that's all we can ever hope for. Thank you very much.